The morning sun stretched its golden fingers across the quiet town, painting the cracked sidewalks and weathered shop fronts in a soft light. On Main Street, a small diner stood at the corner, its neon sign flickering faintly against the sky. The place was nothing special. Red leather booths, a jukebox in the corner, and the smell of fresh coffee drifting out to the street. But for one man, it was a sanctuary. Harold Johnson, a black veteran in his late 70s, came there most mornings, moving carefully with the aid of a cane. His back was stooped, not just from age, but from years of carrying a burden that few would ever understand. His face was lined with the weight of sacrifice, yet his eyes carried a quiet dignity. He had fought for a country that often didn't fight for him in return, but still, he stood tall in spirit. Harold had served in the military decades earlier, through battles that had scarred his body and his soul. He had seen the worst of humanity, on foreign soil and at home, but he had also witnessed the resilience of those who refused to be broken. Every morning, when he entered the diner, the bell above the door rang, and the waitress, a middle-aged woman named Sue, would smile at him warmly. "Morning, Mr. Johnson," she'd say, pouring his coffee before he even had to ask. It was a ritual, a small act of respect that made Harold feel welcome. He would sit at the counter, pull out the newspaper, and let the noise of clinking dishes and murmured conversations wash over him like a balm. But on this particular morning, the air in the diner was different. It carried a tension that Harold felt before he even sat down. A group of young men had gathered in one of the booths near the back. Loud, restless, and brimming with arrogance, they didn't belong to the regulars who frequented the diner. Their laughter was sharp, cutting through the usual calm. They looked like the type who thrived on attention, and the more they spoke, the more eyes turned toward them. Harold recognized the type instantly. Bullies, men who saw weakness as an invitation to wound. He had faced worse than them in combat, but in his country, in his own old age, it was a different kind of battle. Sue gave him an apologetic glance as she refilled his cup. "Don't mind them, Mr. Johnson," she whispered. "They'll be gone soon." Harold nodded, but his instincts told him otherwise. He had lived long enough to know that some people couldn't leave well enough alone. He had endured their kind before, men who couldn't see past the color of his skin, who ignored the service stripes on his sleeve and the years of loyalty to a flag that had not always been loyal to him. The leader of the group, a broad-shouldered man with a cruel smirk, noticed Harold almost immediately. He leaned back in the booth, his arms sprawled carelessly over the top as if he owned the place. "Look at this," he sneered to his friends, nodding in Harold's direction. "The old man thinks he's still somebody." The others laughed, emboldened by his words. Harold lowered his gaze to his coffee, refusing to take the bait. He had learnt long ago that silence was sometimes more powerful than words. But the bully wasn't looking for silence. He was looking for a stage. The man stood and walked toward the counter, his boots heavy against the tile floor. He stopped just a few feet from Harold, towering over him. "Hey, old-timer," he said, his voice dripping with mockery. "What's with a uniform pin? Are you one of those fake veterans? People wear that stuff for sympathy these days." Harold didn't look up. He simply took another sip of his coffee, his hand steady despite the tension rising in the room. Sue hovered nearby, her face pale, unsure whether to intervene. Other customers pretended not to notice, their eyes fixed on their plates, afraid of drawing the bully's attention. "Don't ignore me, old man," the bully snapped, his voice louder now. "You hear me?" Harold finally raised his eyes, calm but firm. "Son, I faced things you couldn't imagine. Go back to your seat and let me finish my coffee in peace." His voice carried the weight of authority, the kind of tone only a man who had commanded respect on the battlefield could muster. For a brief second, the bully faltered, but pride and arrogance wouldn't let him back down. His friends were watching, and he couldn't afford to lose face. With a sudden movement, the man slapped Harold across the face. The sound cracked through the diner like a gunshot. Cups rattled, and Sue gasped audibly. Harold's head snapped to the side, his cane clattering to the floor. For a moment, the world seemed to freeze. The bully's friends roared with laughter, some pounding the table in approval. "That'll teach him," one of them said. Harold didn't retaliate. He didn't shout. Instead, he closed his eyes, steadying his breath, his dignity unshaken despite the sting on his cheek. Inside, Memories of battles long past surged, moments when he had faced down men with far more power and cruelty than this one. He had survived those storms, and he would survive this too. But what the bully didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Harold Johnson wasn't alone in this world. He had a son who carried his father's discipline, his sense of duty, and his unbreakable will. His son was not just another man. He was a leader, a protector, a man who had risen through the ranks of government and now held one of the most powerful positions in the country. His son was the head of Homeland Security. And when he learnt what had happened to his father, the consequences would be swift and unavoidable. In the diner, silence hung heavy after the slap. Sue rushed to Harold's side, placing a trembling hand on his shoulder. "Mr. Johnson, are you all right?" she whispered, her voice thick with fear and outrage. Harold nodded faintly, picking up his cane with slow dignity. His cheek burnt, but his pride remained intact. "I'm fine," he murmured, though the entire diner knew he had been wronged. The bully smirked, satisfied with his display of dominance. He turned back to his friends, basking in their approval. But the moment was not as triumphant as he believed. Eyes had witnessed his cruelty, and whispers would spread beyond these walls. Justice, though sometimes delayed, was inevitable. Harold looked out the window, the sunlight blinding for a moment, and thought of his son. He had raised that boy to be strong, to fight for what was right, to never bow before injustice. And though Harold himself had endured countless slights in silence, he knew his son would not. Somewhere, beyond the reach of this small-town diner, the wheels of justice were already turning. And soon, the bully would learn that every action carries a price, and some prices are far heavier than arrogance can afford. The diner was unusually quiet after the incident, the kind of silence that follows a storm, heavy, trembling, unnatural. People's forks paused halfway to their mouths. Conversations that had once filled the space now hung unfinished. It was as if everyone present knew they had witnessed something far larger than just a cool slap. They had seen dignity tested before their very eyes. Sue stood protectively beside Harold, her hands trembling with both anger and helplessness. "You don't have to take this," she whispered to him, her voice urgent. "He can't just walk away after doing something like that." But Harold placed a gentle hand over hers. "Child," he said softly, "I've taken worse. The world doesn't change because I shout. It changes when justice is its own way of catching up." His tone carried no bitterness, only a tired wisdom born of years of enduring insults and surviving struggles most people could never imagine. The bully smirked as he swaggered back to his booth, slapping his friends on the shoulders, drinking in their laughter like fuel. He thought he had won. In his eyes, the old man was just another target, another example to remind the world of his imagined superiority. But outside the diner, the story was already escaping. A young woman sitting in the corner, who had recorded the entire encounter on her phone, was trembling as she hit upload. Her caption read, "This black veteran survived war for this country. Today, he was slapped in the diner by a bully while people laughed. Remember his face. Remember his dignity." Within minutes, the video began its journey across social media, sparking outrage in circles far beyond the walls of the diner. Harold, however, simply paid his bill with quiet composure, leaving a few crumpled dollars on the counter. He rose with effort, leaning heavily on his cane, and began the slow walk to the door. Every eye followed him. No one moved to stop him. No one dared to offer an apology. He opened the door, the bell jingling softly, and stepped back into the sunlight. That evening, Harold sat on the porch of his modest home. The air was cool, the crickets humming in the distance, but his heart was unsettled. He rubbed the ache in his cheek, remembering not so much the sting of the blow but the arrogance in the young man's eyes. It was the same arrogance Harold had seen in different forms all his life. It was the arrogance of people who believed dignity was something they could strip away with a gesture, a word, or a slap. Inside, the phone rang. Slowly, Harold pushed himself from his chair and answered. On the other end was a voice strong, steady, and filled with both affection and authority. "Dad, how are you doing?" It was Marcus Johnson, Harold's only son. Marcus had grown into a man that Harold could barely recognize sometimes, a man carrying responsibilities that stretched far beyond his family. As the head of Homeland Security, Marcus lived in a world of intelligence briefings, crisis meetings, and decisions that could shift the course of a nation. Yet, in his voice, Harold still heard the little boy who used to run through the yard with a toy airplane, laughing freely. "I'm fine, son," Harold replied, though his tone carried a weight Marcus picked up instantly. "You don't sound fine," Marcus said firmly. "What happened?" Harold hesitated. He had never been a man to complain. He had endured silently, always teaching his son to rise above cruelty. But this time, something inside him faltered. Perhaps it was age. Perhaps it was a realization that silence had cost too much over the years. He took a breath. "Something happened at the diner today." Marcus listened intently as Harold described the scene. The group of young men, the bully's sneer, the slap that echoed through the room. He spoke calmly, almost attached, as though describing something that had happened to someone else. But Marcus heard what his father didn't say. He heard the ache in his pauses, the weight in his sighs. When Harold finished, there was silence on the line, a silence filled with restrained fury. "Who was he?" Marcus asked at last, his voice low and deliberate. "I don't know," Harold admitted. "Doesn't matter. He's just another fool who doesn't understand the cost of dignity." But to Marcus, it mattered. It mattered deeply. He had sworn an oath to protect his country from threats both foreign and domestic. And while his office didn't usually concern itself with petty bullies, this was not just any case. This was his father, the man who had raised him, sacrificed for him, and taught him everything about honor and resilience. The man who had survived the battlefields abroad only to be humiliated at home. "Dad," Marcus said finally, his voice trembling with barely contained anger, "you may let this go, but I won't." Harold sighed, shaking his head even though his son couldn't see it. "Marcus, don't misuse your position for me. Justice isn't about power, it's about patience." But Marcus's mind was already turning, not with thoughts of vengeance, but with resolve. His father had been patient all his life. He had turned the other cheek again and again, bearing scars in silence. But Marcus had the means to make sure this story wasn't buried. The next morning, Marcus sat in his office, the video already on his screen. He had seen countless acts of cruelty in his career, but nothing twisted his gut like seeing his father, the strongest man he knew, slapped across the face by a swaggering coward. His father didn't cry out, didn't retaliate. He simply endured. That strength, that dignity, broke Marcus's heart even more than the slap itself. By midday, the video had gone viral. News stations were replaying it, commentators condemning it, and activists demanding justice. Hashtags with Harold's name trended on social media, painting him as a symbol of resilience and as yet another reminder of the discrimination that still plagued the country. The bully, meanwhile, was oblivious to the storm he had unleashed. He boasted to his friends about the lesson he had taught the old man, not realizing that his face was plastered across every television screen, every timeline, every conversation. The walls were closing in, though he didn't see it yet. Back at Harold's home, Sue stopped by with groceries. "You become the talk of the town," she said softly, setting the bags on his kitchen counter. Harold grimaced. "I never asked for that." "I know," she replied, her eyes kind. "But sometimes, Mr. Johnson, you don't get to choose. Sometimes the world chooses you. And right now, people are looking to you. They see your dignity. They see your courage. And they want to follow it." Harold chuckled weakly. "I'm too old to lead anything." "Maybe so," Sue said, "but you raised a man who can." That night, Marcus visited his father. He had cleared his schedule, ignoring protest from aides and advisors. When Harold opened the door, he saw not the official, not the powerful figure so many feared and respected, but simply his son, his boy. They sat together in the living room, the television muted as news anchors' lips moved silently over images of Harold in the diner. Marcus looked at his father, his eyes wet with unspoken emotion. "I can't let this stand, Dad. Not because of who I am, but because of who you are. You taught me that justice matters, that dignity matters. If I don't stand up for you, then what does all my power mean?" Harold studied his son, pride and worry mixing in his expression. "Justice, Marcus, is not about revenge. Don't forget that." "I won't," Marcus promised. "But I also won't let that man walk free as though your your sacrifice, and your humanity meant nothing. He has to learn that actions have consequences. The room fell quiet again, the two men bound by love and shared pain. Outside, the night deepened. The bully still slept soundly in his arrogance, unaware that the tide was turning against him. He had touched a man he thought was powerless. Instead, he had awakened a storm that was just beginning to rise. And soon, the world would see what happened when arrogance collided with justice. Morning broke in the small town, but the bully, whose name was Derek Kane, was blissfully unaware of the storm brewing beyond his narrow world. He strutted through his day with the same arrogance he had worn at the diner, recounting the incident as though it were a badge of honor. You should have seen his face, Derek boasted to a co-worker at the auto shop where he worked. The old man just sat there like a scared puppy. Weak. His laughter rang hollow, but his co-worker didn't laugh back. Instead, he muttered something and walked away, shaking his head. Derek noticed, confused, but shrugged it off. He had no idea that by then millions had already seen his cruelty captured in stark detail. By mid-morning, the local news vans began to roll into town. Reporters set up outside the diner, cameras flashing, microphones extended, hungry for every detail. Sue, the waitress, found herself thrust into the spotlight. Standing nervously on the steps, she told reporters what had happened. Her voice trembled with both anger and shame. "He slapped Mr. Johnson," she said, her eyes brimming with tears. "A man who served his country, who comes here every day just to drink his coffee in peace. And no one stopped him. None of us had the courage." The footage aired on evening broadcasts across the nation. Anchors replayed the slap again and again, contrasting it with Harold's quiet dignity. Panels of commentators discussed not just the incident, but the larger truth it represented, the disrespect faced by black veterans who had given their all for a country that still allowed prejudice to linger in its heart. Derek finally learned of his unwanted fame when his phone buzzed relentlessly with messages. At first, he grinned, thinking maybe someone had posted one of his barroom antics. But when he clicked the link, his smile evaporated. There he was on the screen, slapping Harold Johnson across the face, frozen in slow motion as millions judged him with their eyes. "What the—" Derek muttered, pacing his living room. Comments scrolled across the screen. "Coward. Racist thug. Wait till he finds out who that veteran's son is." Derek's blood ran cold. He had no idea what that last comment meant, but he knew it couldn't be good. Panic crept in, but his pride smothered it. He smashed his phone on the table, muttering curses, convinced the world was overreacting. Meanwhile, in Washington, Marcus sat in his office, reviewing a stack of reports. His aides briefed him on escalating public outrage. "Sir, the nation's watching," one said quietly. "This isn't just a viral video anymore. It's becoming a symbol." Marcus leaned back in his chair, his jaw tight. He knew this was more than personal. It was about history, about every veteran who had come home to find no welcome, about every black elder who had been disrespected despite years of sacrifice. His father had become a face for all of them. "I want everything on this man," Marcus said firmly. "His name, his record, his affiliations. Nothing hidden." By the next day, a dossier lay on Marcus's desk. Derek Kane, age 32, has a history of bar fights and small-time arrests swept under the rug by a family with minor political connections. Nothing major, nothing to warrant national attention. Until now. Marcus studied the file, his expression unreadable. "Men like him," he said quietly to himself, "think the world will always look the other way." He closed the folder. Not this time. Back in town, Derek's life unraveled quickly. Strangers hurled insults at him on the street. His boss called him into the office and told him not to come back. "You brought shame on this whole town, Derek," the man said, shaking his head. "We don't need that here." His friend stopped answering his calls. Even his own mother slammed the door when he appeared on her porch, muttering that she'd raised him better than this. Derek lashed out, convinced he was a victim. "It was just an old man," he shouted at no one in particular. "I didn't do anything that bad." But the walls closed tighter each day. His arrogance couldn't shield him anymore. Meanwhile, Harold watched all of it unfold from the quiet of his home. Sue often came by to share the latest headlines, her voice bubbling with both outrage and relief. But Harold remained reserved, almost attached. "The boy's paying his price," he said simply, his cane resting across his knees. "That's enough for me." Yet Marcus knew it wasn't enough. Not because of vengeance, but because true justice demanded accountability. So he traveled back to the town, this time not as a high official from Washington, but as a son standing beside his father. When he walked into the diner with Harold at his side, the room fell silent. Every patron rose instinctively, sensing the gravity of the moment. Sue's eyes filled with tears as she hurried forward. "Mr. Johnson, Mr. Marcus, I'm so sorry for what happened here. We should have stopped it." Marcus placed a hand on her shoulder. "You spoke up afterward. That took courage. Don't think it went unnoticed." As he guided his father to their booth, Marcus caught the whispers swirling in the room. People spoke of Harold with newfound reverence and of Derek with scorn. The tide of respect was turning, and Harold, quiet, humble Harold, was its center. Later that day, Marcus arranged a meeting at the town hall, where reporters, officials, and townsfolk gathered. Standing at the podium, Marcus looked out at the crowd, his father seated in the front row. His voice carried the weight of both personal pain and national responsibility. "My father," Marcus began, "is a veteran who served his country with honor. He faced enemies abroad with courage, and yet here, at home, he was struck not because he provoked anyone, not because he threatened anyone, but because of the color of his skin and the arrogance of a man who thought dignity could be stolen with a slap. But what that man didn't realize is this: dignity cannot be taken. It can only be surrendered. And my father never surrendered." Applause broke out, some people rising to their feet, tears streaming down their faces. Marcus continued, his tone firm. "This is not just about one man in a diner. This is about the America we choose to be. Do we let bullies go unchecked? Do we stay silent when injustice stands before us? Or do we stand together, regardless of race, age, or station, and say, 'Enough'?" The room erupted again, and Harold sat quietly, tears glistening in his eyes. He had never sought the spotlight, but in that moment, he understood that his story had become something larger than himself. Across town, Derek watched the broadcast on a dusty bar television. His fists clenched as the crowd cheered Marcus's words. Rage boiled in him, but beneath it, fear grew. The world was no longer laughing with him. It was condemning him. And for the first time, Derek realized he was truly alone. That night, Marcus returned to his father's porch. They sat side by side in the quiet, listening to the night sounds. Harold finally spoke, his voice low. "Son, I never wanted you to use your power for me. But today, you didn't do it for me alone. You did it for every man like me who's been overlooked." Marcus nodded. "That was the point. Dad, your silence all those years, it carried strength. But sometimes, silence has to end. Sometimes, the world needs to hear the truth shouted." Harold leaned back in his chair, his eyes on the stars. For the first time in a long while, he felt the weight on his shoulders lift just a little. But Derek's story wasn't finished. Though the public scorn was crushing, real consequences had yet to arrive. Marcus knew it. The town knew it. And soon Derek himself would learn that humiliation was only the beginning. Justice, in its fullest form, was still on its way. The days that followed Marcus's speech at the town hall were a whirlwind. News outlets replayed his words alongside the video of Harold's slap, creating a story that refused to fade. Commentators called it a national moment of reckoning, while ordinary citizens wrote letters and emails to express their outrage and admiration. Across the country, veterans groups rallied behind Harold. Black elders saw in him a mirror of their own struggles and dignity, and younger generations felt a new fire of responsibility. But not everyone was ready to let Derek Kane slip away with only the weight of public shame. Laws had been broken. Assault had been committed. The difference now was that there was no hiding from accountability. A week later, Derek sat in his small apartment, blinds drawn, empty bottles scattered on the table. His once confident swagger had been replaced with paranoia. Every knock on the door made him flinch. Every shadow outside the window felt like a threat. He had been fired, abandoned by friends, and rejected by family. Still, he muttered to himself in bitter defiance. They are making a big deal out of nothing. Just one slap. Just one old man. But that old man was Harold Johnson, and Derek's ignorance of Harold's life service, and family had become his undoing. The official notice came one morning in the form of uniformed officers at his door. Derek opened it groggily, his eyes bloodshot, his mouth dry. "Mr. Kane," one officer said sternly, "you under arrest for assault." Derek sputtered, tried to argue, but the words caught in his throat. The cameras across the street captured everything. The same man who once struck an elderly veteran is now cuffed, his head lowered, his defiance faltering. As news of the arrest spread, Harold sat quietly in his armchair, watching the television. Sue was with him, holding his hand. "Justice," she whispered. Harold nodded slowly. "Justice," he repeated, though his tone carried no triumph, only a weary sense of completion. Marcus, watching from Washington, allowed himself a breath of relief. But he knew his father's journey meant more than one man being punished. The story had unearthed something deeper in the nation's conscience. He resolved to use it. When Derek's trial began, the courtroom filled quickly. Veterans in uniform sat side by side with activists, townsfolk, and members of the media. Harold attended with Marcus by his side, moving slowly with his cane but carrying himself with the same quiet strength. When he entered, people stood, as if in silent tribute. The prosecutor laid out the facts clearly: a decorated veteran, unprovoked, humiliated in public by a younger man acting out of arrogance and malice. Witnesses, including Sue and other diner patrons, testified with trembling voices, recounting their shame at having remained silent in the moment. And then came the video, played on the courtroom screen, the sound of the slap echoing in the chamber. Derek shrank in his seat as the jury watched, his once smug expression gone. When it was Derek's turn to speak, he tried to muster excuses. "It was just a joke. I didn't mean," but his words crumbled under the weight of his actions. Even his own lawyer seemed weary of defending him. At last, the jury returned. "Guilty." The judge, his voice firm, sentenced Derek not only to jail time but also to mandatory community service, specifically with veterans groups. "Perhaps," the judge said, his eyes piercing Derek, "working among those you disrespected will teach you the value of service, dignity, and sacrifice." The gavel struck, and it was over. Derek was led away, his head bowed. For Harold, the moment was bittersweet. He had never sought vengeance. In fact, he had long ago resigned himself to a life where justice came slowly, if at all. But this time was different. This time, the world had not turned away. In the months that followed, Marcus spearheaded initiatives within Homeland Security and beyond to protect veterans, particularly black veterans, against discrimination and abuse. He worked with lawmakers to ensure stronger penalties for assaults on elders and veterans, and he launched national campaigns that celebrated their contributions. Harold's story became the spark for reform. But for Harold himself, the most profound change was quieter. At the diner where it had all begun, things were never the same again. Patrons greeted him with respect. Strangers came just to shake his hand. Sue would beam every time he walked in, pouring his coffee with a pride that seemed to fill the whole room. One afternoon, as Harold sat by the window with his newspaper, a young boy approached. Nervously clutching a notepad, he asked, "Mr. Johnson, can I ask you something? My teacher told us about you. She said you never gave up your dignity, even when someone tried to take it. How do you do that?" Harold smiled, folding his paper. He looked at the boy, his eyes warm. "Son, dignity isn't something a man gives you. It's something you carry inside. No one can take it, unless you let them. Remember that." The boy nodded, scribbling the words down as if they were treasure. Harold chuckled softly, returning to his coffee. For the first time in many years, he felt a sense of peace. Meanwhile, Derek served his sentence. Reports came back that at first he resisted, sneering at the veterans he was forced to work beside. But over time, something shifted. He began to listen to their stories. Stories of sacrifice, courage, and loss. He began to see the humanity he had once mocked. Whether redemption was possible remained uncertain, but seeds had been planted. The story of Harold Johnson lived on, retold in articles, classrooms, and documentaries. Not as a tale of victimhood, but of dignity, justice, and resilience. It became a reminder that one act of cruelty could awaken a movement, and that even in the twilight of life, a man could stand as a beacon for others. On Harold's 81st birthday, the town held a small ceremony at the diner. Veterans gathered, children sang, and Marcus presented his father with a plaque inscribed with words that echoed through the years. To Harold Johnson, who showed us that dignity stands taller than hate, and that justice, though delayed, always finds its way. Harold, cane in hand, stood to address the crowd. His voice was soft, yet it carried to every corner. I didn't ask for this attention. All I ever wanted was to live my life in peace, like any man. But if my story has helped remind us of who we are and who we must be, then I thank God for it. This country, it's still learning. But as long as we stand together, it will learn. The crowd rose to its feet, applause thunderous, tears flowing. Marcus stood beside his father, proud not only as a son but also as a man who had witnessed firsthand the unbreakable strength of dignity. That night, as Harold sat once more on his porch, the stars bright overhead, he felt a calm he hadn't known in years. He thought of the battles he had fought, both abroad and at home. He thought of the slap in the diner and of the countless unseen slaps endured by others before him. But most of all, he thought of the future, the young boy who had asked about dignity, the veterans who had found renewed respect, and the nation that had taken one more step forward. He closed his eyes, breathing deeply. His work, in many ways, was done. His legacy, however, was just beginning.